one, then one again for immediate emotional support. Between sessions, you can visit our comfort suite where we provide a safe haven. You'll find a comfort suite in community under the main navigation in Hoover. We have a couple of surveys. If you registered for a continuing education credit for CEU, please check the chat for links. The first link will sign you in for your CEU. Please sign in at the beginning of the session. After the workshop, there will be another link for CEU evaluations. Please click on that link for a short evaluation, which also includes the CEU request form. Once you've completed the evaluation, you'll be taken to a page with a link to your CEU certificate. We'll also post a link for the workshop evaluation in chat. I also need to let you know that we have some great conference merchandise. So be sure to check out our online store at ctaafsc.com/shop. That is ctaafsc.com/shop. Please join me in welcoming our presenter, Dr. Rosalie Martin. Dr. Martin is an activist, social worker, writer, and university professor at Houston-Tillotson University for over 47 years. As a sociologist, she has a passion, and she is passionate about engaging her students in social justice activities through their words and actions. As a Black mother and grandmother, Dr. Martin is constantly helping them navigate being Black in a racially divided country. Having to give the talk is traumatic to them and her. Recognizing historical trauma is real and must be addressed. Bringing Blacks to all tables of decision-making will make the U.S. experiment in democracy greater than it has ever been. When equity is provided, trauma, healing, and resiliency are the inevitable outcome. You can learn more about Dr. Martin by reading her bio in Hoover. Now, let's enjoy the presentation. We will be back together soon for a live Q&A. Dr. Martin, please take the stage.
Hello, my name is Rosalie Martin. I have participated in Central Texas African American Family Support Conference on several occasions, and I'm very pleased to participate today. The topic of my presentation is historical trauma and resiliency among African Americans. I'm interested in this topic on many levels, have done much research. Currently, I teach at Houston-Tillotson University, where I'm professor of sociology. Additionally, I am a social worker, a poet, and author with research interests in HIV, mass incarceration, mental health, racism, family, conflict resolution, and many other areas. I ask that you listen with an open heart as well as with an open mind. Living out the consequences of generational trauma is far more horrific than learning about it. Both historical and current perpetrators and victims must tell the truth before real healing can occur. For those whites who say we must get over it as it was a thing of the past? Would you be willing to live a week or even a day in Black skin? This workshop would address Blacks' generational trauma at the hands of whites by briefly recounting highlights from the 400 years of contact and, of course, Black resilience. The objectives of this seminar is truth-telling. Participants will understand historical and personal racism that causes trauma among African Americans. They will know the consequences of historical trauma personally and generationally. They will be given information on how African Americans move towards personal and group healing. And for our white participants, you will learn ways to become allies to African Americans by creating, supporting more equitable spaces and institutions free of racist intent, and by advocating for racial social justice. Historical trauma. Trauma is defined as any event beyond a person's ability to cope with, which includes personal, group, historical events. It is an overwhelming experience where one loses connection with what is safe, reducing access to internal resources and controlled. Although African American experience many types of trauma, as you can see in the next slide, such as individual trauma, a traumatic event that happens to a single person; group trauma, a traumatic event that a group shares that witnesses violence against another family member; and community trauma, such as the witness of George Floyd, the death of George Floyd's death. But this particular workshop is on historical trauma, which includes such things as community trauma, as well as personal and individual and group trauma. And historical trauma is a series of traumatic events causes emotional harm that is transferred to the generations that follows. African Americans' historical trauma is the collective spiritual, psychological, emotional, and cognitive distress that perpetuate intergenerational harm from multiple inhumane experiences originating with slavery and continues to the present day. Racist-driven violence has caused fear passed down through generations in the form of toxic stress and altered DNA. An individual does not have to experience the event, but is still deeply affected by it. African Americans' traumatic history, and it still continues to today. I recommend that you look at a video on YouTube called Unchained. It's a documentary that explores the roots of African American racism, the process to usher lasting reconciliation. It includes a white man that acknowledges his ancestral past and how it impacted negatively with Blacks. I'm also wanting you to look at excerpts from a letter of William Lynch on the making of a slave, 1712. He says, in order to break Blacks physically and emotionally, that he has a foolproof method for controlling your Black slaves for at least 300 years. He says, as a slave owner, I use fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes. Distrust is stronger than trust, and envy is stronger than respect or admiration. Pit young Black male against the old Black male. You must use the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves, and vice versa. You must use the female versus the male, vice versa. You may also have your white servants and overseers distrust all Blacks. But it is necessary that your slaves trust and depend on us, whites. They, the slaves, must love, respect, and trust only us. Divide and conquer. He further says that we can break them like a horse by taking the meanest and most restless Nigger, I'm saying it only once, and later on I'll use the letter N. Strip him of his clothes in front of the remaining male N, the female, and the N infant. Tar and feather him. Tie each leg to a different horse in opposite directions. Set him on fire and beat both horses to pull him apart in front of the remaining ends. The next step is to take a bullwhip and beat the remaining end male to the point of death in front of the female and the infant. But don't kill him, but put the fear of God in him, for he can be useful for future breeding. We reverse the nature by burning and pulling one civilized in, and the key word, they were civilized and apart, and bullwhipping the other to the point of death, all in her presence. And so there are three patterns of thinking used to justify a system in enslavement. Animalization, for they're not human, 3/5 persons under slavery. Demonization, they are human, but something is very wrong with them under Jim Crow. And infantilization, they are human, nothing is really wrong with them, but they are not our intellectual equals. We find this in the 20th and 21st century with exceptions like Barack Obama. As we look at historical trauma, we have to take a very close look at slavery and what it meant for Blacks who were not originally slaves. They came from Africa and great kingdoms in Africa, but they were made into slaves in the US and other nations around the world. And this was done by the laws and the culture in which they were brought into. So slavery was during the period of 1619, 1863. Slavery ended at the end of the Civil War, 1863, when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But in Texas and Oklahoma was not informed until 1865. Hence, we celebrate Juneteenth. I should note right here, however, that Lincoln did not end slavery because of his moral thoughts about how slave is wrong, but in fact, in order to keep this union from separating. At the end of slavery, there's a period we call the Reconstruction era, 1863 to 1877. During this time, three major amendments were passed. The 13th Amendment, there's a movie called 13th, by the way, where it looks at the fact that although it abolished slavery, it abolished those except as a punishment for crime, which meant that criminals can still be enslaved. The 14th Amendment says that all citizens can get due process under the law, but we know that there are two justices, one for others and one for Blacks. And then the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, cannot deny because of race, still needed new legislations to be passed in order to enfranchise all of the people of the US. And still now, there are attempts to still disenfranchise Blacks. During the Reconstruction era, more than 1,500 African Americans held political office, making this era the most democratic time prior to the civil rights laws of 1964. In direct response to the more humane Reconstruction period, the Jim Crow era came into being. It legalized racism. The strategy was to make whites feel superior and Blacks inferior. This era came into being with the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896. The doctrine, separate but equal, became the universal doctrine of our country. But we all know that separate is never, ever equal. As a result of the Jim Crow laws, They marginalize and they dehumanize African Americans. And those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrests, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. The strategy was to pit poor whites against blacks so whites can feel superior. Colored waiting room, separate schools, separate housing, all in an attempt to keep blacks in their place. We know this was an era for KKK to have free range in killing and directing violence towards blacks. And the law did not prevent it. In fact, the law protected whites. Few, if any, were held accountable for how they beat, burned, and lynched blacks. And it was not only the lynching, blacks from a tree that occurred, but racial terror lynching occurred as well, which is the direct violence towards a community to create a system of hierarchy that is whites being superior and blacks being inferior. And they did this through violence. And it occurred for anything whites considered as social transgression, such as a black boy whistling at a white girl. And that could have result in violence and even death, as was the case with Emmett Till. And by the way, did you know that those shaping the Nazi doctrine used the United States Jim Crow laws, including forbidding interracial marriage, as their model? Brown versus the Board of Education was argued to the Supreme Court in 1954, some 67 years later after Plessy versus Ferguson, in order to abolish the segregation in public schools and by implication the entire system of segregation in the South. Attorney Thurgood Marshall later became a Supreme Court justice. The decision by the Brown versus Board of Education in the Supreme Court justices says that schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed. In essence, what they really said was you can take your time, states, and in order to do this. Austin did not totally desegregate until the late 70s, 1970s, and the early 1980s. The strategy was pit poor whites against blacks to keep Jim Crow in place. As mentioned earlier, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in public places, provided for the integration of schools and other public facilities, and made employment discrimination illegal. It was the most sweeping civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction era. So you see on your right a picture of LBJ shaking hands with Martin Luther King and all the supporters for this Civil Rights Act. On your left hand are all those who, the white supremacists who continue to support separate and unequal for blacks as relates to whites. The Voter Rights Acts of 1965 was passed, prohibiting illiteracy tests and poll taxes as a way to enfranchise blacks in voting. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who signed the Civil Rights Acts that we just saw, was once asked why did poor white Republicans repeatedly vote against their own best interests? Actually, this is a great question for even now as to why white Republicans today voted against their interests when in fact the Obama Act, Obamacare, has been destroyed by white Republicans, and many of the poor needed health care. But LBJ's response was, if you can't convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't know you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him someone to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. The strategic here was to pit poor whites against blacks to control whites. In other words, poor whites and blacks are being controlled by white elites. John Lewis said that Emmett Till was his George Floyd. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who lived in Chicago, went down south to be with family. While there, he allegedly whistled at a white girl. This is 1955, was murdered for that, and his murderers were never charged. His mother left the casket opened for all to see, and that's on the top of your screen. George Floyd was killed by police officer Derek Chauvin in 2020. Police brutality continues. You see that picture on the bottom to your right. The strategy is make whites afraid of blacks, resulting in whites acting violently towards blacks. As a result of the multiple deaths by police, and especially upon the death of George Floyd, protesters cried out, "Say their names," and "I can't breathe," as those were the last words of George Floyd, as well as others, such as Eric Gardner. So on your right, you see names of blacks who were killed at the hands of police. It has not stopped, and we know it will continue until we have change of legislation on a local as well as the national level to have police officers held accountable for their actions. Not only police officers continue to act against blacks, but many personalities. In this case, I'm looking at former President Donald Trump, who even before he became president was anti-Black on a lot of levels, didn't want blacks in his apartment buildings. And when the Central Park Five was held responsible for the jogger in Central Park, the woman in Central Park, but they were let go because they did not do it. Despite that, Donald Trump took out a full page ad to say they should experience the death penalty. Not only then, before he became president, he claimed that Obama was not born a citizen in the US, and he birthed, this is Donald Trump, the birther movement. What Donald Trump really was saying during his, when he was running for president and during his presidency, when he said, "Make America great again," what he really was saying, "Let's make America white again." For blacks, America was never great, as I've already said. What Donald Trump and others like him did was to support hate crimes as white supremacists continue to direct hate crimes towards blacks, but they also hate crimes towards other groups. In 2019, the hate crimes, 58.5% were directed towards blacks, sexual orientation, 16.9% because of religion, 23.3%. But blacks also experience very subtle and sometimes not so subtle discrimination and racist dialogue directed towards them. We call this microaggression. When overt racism was no longer socially acceptable. Microaggression is subtle racialized behavior that marginalizes African Americans, race-based attitudes and behavior that supports white privilege. Examples are when a Black person must change their hairstyle, let's say from an afro or dreadlocks for upward mobility. When Black is overlooked at a grocery store, or a department store. When police officers racially profile Blacks. When whites are oblivious or ignorant, they say, to Black historical experiences. And when whites can't get a qualified Black to fill a position. So microaggressions is racism in a more subtle way, still hostile. There's still negative messages, oppressive types of acts, insults. And you can hear such things as all lives matter. Well, we know all lives matter, but did white people know that during slavery, during Jim Crow? Do they know that even now? So why are they offended when we say Black Lives Matter? And so why do you lead strategic tactics to pit whites against Blacks to maintain a system of oppression? And they do this by making whites feel superior, by making Blacks feel inferior. They do this by creating stereotypes and myths in order to create places and spaces that will keep Blacks in their place. These myths includes Blacks are lazy, they're violent, they're drug addicts, drug dealers, they lack self-control, they are poor parents. And our research shows that whites commit more violent crimes but get lower and fewer sentences. If given the same education and economic opportunities, Black excels in everything they do. And so whites must acknowledge and eliminate these strategies and myths in order to move towards social healing and equity. I kind of summarize all that I've said in a poem I wrote. It's called Are We Cursed? Are we children of Ham of biblical days doomed for generational oppression? Should we accept our status less than no good, second class citizens needed for taxation purposes to reduce slave owners' tax bill, treated as three-fifth persons? Are we cursed? Throwaways, valueless, scum of the earth, to be treated as such and no recourse, to be forced to accept treatment and to pass it on to our children and their children. Cursed. Filthy rags to be discarded, stepped upon, and tossed away, replaced by another cursed one, and no love lost there. You made us in our own image, breathed the breath of life into me, and said that we are good. So why abuse, misuse, trample upon, and treated as being cursed? Why our children and grandchildren are hauled into jail, no trial or jury, even worse, killed by cops because of the color of their skin, Black. Is Black skin cursed, has no redemption, majority educated and poorly funded schools, parents are underemployed, lack such benefits as health care, and grandparents in assisted living and nursing homes, poorly staffed and inadequately cared for? Is Black skin cursed? Jails built just for them by third grade, even before a crime committed. 13% US population, but 40% of prison inmates. Incarceration, a new slavery. Prisoners work for free for big industries for indefinite time. Racial slurs and microaggressions dig below the skin, causing kids and youth to feel less than and their rights held hostage for life, with votes suppressed to maintain white power, leaving us frustrated, isolated, and alone. And everything seems the same with endless cycle, cursed. Can it be broken? Can equity become a norm? Can justice be for all? Can vote not be taken for granted? Can curse be removed and generations become free? And would a white person want to become Black like me? What are the consequences of historical racism and trauma? Psychological consequences of traumatic racism is post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, having flashbacks to those times when they were hurt and injured, emotionally and psychologically just because of their race. Fear. African Americans often fear police. In fact, parents teach their children to avoid the police at all costs. We find that their hypervigilance and triggers sometimes take them back to those moments of fear and avoidance. People who have experienced trauma are 15 more times likely to commit suicide and to complete it. 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to get a sexually transmitted disease, 4 times more likely to inject drugs, 3 times more likely to take other types of drugs and be absent from work. And so there are these consequences of traumatic experiences. Don't overlook them. We know that trauma lies on a continuum, but it's always about a fight, flight, freeze response. When we're faced with a threat, a message is sent to the amygdala and the limbic system of the brain. The amygdala assesses the threat and sends a message to the brain stem to either activate the fight, the flight, or the freeze response. And so if a person is in the fight response, they attack their anger, and angry, there's the emotion. Outcomes, they insult, they blame, they mistreat others. If they flight, they hide. The emotion is one of denial. The outcomes, they avoid, they omit, or they may even sabotage. If they freeze, their action is to comply. They shut down their emotions. The outcomes is justify and rationalize. And if they face the fear, the action is defend, being connected, the outcomes preserve and mitigate. I am very sure you've seen people using each of these responses. And these responses are not only for adults, but they're created very early in the life of a child. Black children learn very early it is being Black is not all right. In fact, to be Black is to get back. I remember as a young child, I used to play this hand game. We would clap each other's hand, and we used to say, if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, hang around. If you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're Black, get back. And we see this in this Black doll, white doll experiment. It's on YouTube, so I suggest you go look at it. Children were asked, Black children were asked, which doll would they choose to play with? More often than not, they would choose the white doll. They were asked questions like, which doll is a good doll? And they would pick up the white doll. And when they were asked, why did you pick that doll? They would say, because she's white. When they were asked which doll is a bad doll, they would pick up the black doll. And when asked why is that doll bad? And the response would be, because it's Black. And then the researcher asked a very powerful question: which doll looks like you? And the young girls pick up the Black doll. This is after they have said the Black is a bad doll. This self loathing begins that early and may lead to low self esteem, maladaptive behavior, dependency, addictions, violence, and many other behavior. So, the body manifestation of trauma happens to people in very different ways. This man, anonymous man, shared his reaction to seeing George Floyd dying in front of his face for 8 minutes, 42 seconds. Many of you remember this as well. He says, I later realized this was generational trauma I was re-experiencing. In other words, my body was replaying the persecution of people I've never ever met from decades or even centuries before I was born. And all of this happened from just watching George Floyd die on the video. Historical trauma. What about the social economic consequences of historical race, historical trauma? We know that the symptoms of community trauma, their intergenerational poverty, even maybe welfare from one generation to the next, long-term unemployment or cycling unemployment with low-paying jobs, relocation of businesses and jobs, limited employment in the community, and not having transportation to go out of the community to get employment, disinvestment. People living in the inner city find that it's deteriorating, unhealthy, often dangerous in public spaces with crumbling environment, unhealthy products in that community, food deserts in that community, unhealthy food in that community, disconnected, damaged social relationships when we look at the people, um, poor social networks, the elevation of destruction, a low sense of collective political and social efficacy. In that community, you may find people, a low rate people registered to vote. The sense of apathy and why bother, my life has not changed. And so all these you may see as a result of the trauma that has been felt by members in these communities. We know in these various communities, the Blacks is 21.2% likely to be employed compared to white non-Hispanic, 8.7% of them unemployed, Asian 10%, and Hispanic of any race 18%. We also find that within the schools in the inner city, even though they're integrated, many of them lack a lot of the resources that are needed in order to close the achievement gap. Some of them have very low report cards within within the Black community or the poor community. And so it's important to close the educational and digital divide with money and academic resources. Blacks are just as intelligent. Their abilities are great, but the limitation may come because they don't have access to the resources. When we look at Blacks in the healthcare and the healthcare system, historically, there were separate hospitals, those for whites and those lesser ones with fewer advantages and benefits for getting Blacks well in the Black hospitals. In fact, a Black man who developed blood plasma separated for blood transfusion, Charles Drew, needed a blood transfusion after a car accident, went to a white hospital, was not admitted, and died before he could get what he needed. There's a lot of Black distrust due to the medical malpractice. We know about the syphilis experiment and other kinds of experiments that have been done on Blacks, resulting in this distrust. Also, many are not inclined to get the COVID-19 vaccination because they still wonder if the vaccination would be different for Blacks versus whites. We know that African Americans are more likely to die at early ages from all causes of diseases. When we look at the school to prison pipeline, very often when considering where to plant prisons, research is done in school systems to find out what's going on with third graders. How well are they adapting? How many of them are behaving in such a way that they may end up having to be in the prison system? Can you imagine third graders? In the ghettos, we already made some reference to our ghettos. There's families do receive welfare. Um, they can receive welfare. Mothers sometimes are called welfare queens. A lot of stereotypes about women who are on welfare in order to take care of their children. There were rules in the 1960s whereby they called midnight raid, where welfare workers can go in the house of welfare recipients to find out if there were any men in the home, if they had any TV, if they had telephone. I know this as a fact because I was raised on welfare and this happened in my household. But we must note that rich people get more wealthy than the poor in the form of subsidies. Don't forget that point. We know within our ghettos that the low education, industrial type manufacturing jobs have moved out a lot of times and automated. We already mentioned the disintegration within the communities, high drugs and crime within the communities, exodus of jobs and middle class from the urban centers take their disposable incomes with them. We also see a high level of single parent household, the single parent being the mother. We know in 1960, 20% of the children were raised by single parents, but by 2020, it is now at 72%. And this is in part due to mass incarceration. And so mass incarceration affects our families far more than it affects other families. With the high percent, disproportionately high percent of Blacks in prison, the Black children are traumatized and many engage in destructive behavior, resulting in their incarceration as well. Um, Many of them have not learned how to be parent when they have their own children. And so that's another way in which we have this generational trauma passed on. The data in this graph is from 2010. This is according to 100,000 persons, that 2,207 from 100,000 will be incarcerated for Blacks, Latino, 966, and whites, 380. The get tough on crime was really a get tough on Blacks. When you think about it, Blacks were stopped for quote unquote reasonable suspicion. They didn't have to do anything but be in a group and they could be stopped and frisked. They could be walking with a backpack. They can be traveling with luggage or without luggage. They can be in a car that was too expensive, perceived as being too expensive for them to be driving. A stoplight, they didn't stop at a stoplight. Just any reason to stop them. And then once they're stopped, to fist them. And this was upheld by the Supreme Court in the Terry versus Ohio case of 1968, and thus is called the Terry stop or stop and frisk. Strategy: appease good whites by reducing their fears against Blacks, removing Blacks from the community, and dealing with personal trauma. How do we deal with it? Building resilience after trauma, there are key factors that may help. And some of this is done in therapy, and some of this can be done peer to peer. First, if we have a strong parent or a surrogate who can act as if a parent in a parent child relationship, they often filter much of the negative messages given to their kids, reinforcing their self worth, letting them know that they're important, that they're beautiful, that they can achieve, that they can do this, despite the media or information from schools or other institutions. It is important for individuals to develop and strengthen their cognitive skills, what they think, and, and which predicts success and leads to rule abiding behavior. Increasing one's ability to self regulate and their attention, emotions, and their behaviors. Not be drawn into fights, not be drawn into negative strategies that has been put out there in order to trap them. So we have whites dealing with Blacks' psychological trauma. We must provide psychological safety, which means creating a compassionate environment free of judgment and criticism, acknowledge and honor African Americans' human dignity and unique skills. The historical experiences are worthy of the respect, honor, and remembrance. Develop the knowledge and empathy to view others' experience through the lenses of racial trauma, learning, accepting our country's history that perpetuate the hierarchical and the caste system while denying Blacks' vast contributions. Can you imagine the U.S. Without the contributions of Blacks? In repairing the traumatic memory, whites can do not patronize Blacks. That's one way to push whites away. Many situations that might seem benign could be discriminatory and traumatic when seen through racial lens. Be open to different interpretations. Acknowledge your own biases, your values, your microaggressions that hinder Blacks reaching their potentials. Recognize your white privilege. Do not blame the victim. And as we think about ways to change and to reduce the traumatic effect on our communities, residents can come together as a community, and they have. And through their own initiatives, they have made changes in their communities. They make changes within and through their institutions, including the church and government. If you look on your left, I have the restorative justice. We know that one way to stop the school to prison pipeline is to use restorative practices in the classrooms. It's a way of supporting healing among individuals. It looks at opportunities for individuals to forgive, to look at their own attitudes. And it's also done in the criminal justice system where perpetrator and victim comes together for the purpose of healing and reconciliations. We know that the church has been the center of much civil rights movement, and it continues to be that. People who are connected to their church listen to their leaders. And we're doing this by changing lives, one person at a time. And so how do we deal with institutional and systemic racism? What can be done? We must recognize upfront that the current systems, we're talking about educational system, government, welfare system, are doing what is designed to do to keep Blacks enslaved or to keep them from meeting their potential. What we need is a new system that is more equitable for all. We need new legislation um, to keep police officers accountable and make them responsible for their actions, for example. New legislations that provides felons with an opportunity to enter into their community on a clean slate so they can do better. And so the systems are doing what it was designed to do. New systems must be created. And we know that these new systems need to incorporate new values. The system must target oppression. It must acknowledge the history and from that, look at ways to call people to action. We must reduce the poverty. We must emphasize liberation. And all of this will result in ending racism. And I leave the Black Lives Matter for last. It's important for us to understand why the Black Lives Matter movement came together at the first place. It came in as a result of police brutality. But as we look at the history we just went over, Black lives have not mattered in the past. And it's important that whites are not offended by the Black Lives Matter movement or the terminology. It's only once we recognize the fact that Black lives do matter that we can actually end racism. Racism needs to be ended in the healthcare system where there's been inequities throughout our history. I've already mentioned some of the inequities. And so we have to fight for social justice in the healthcare system. It's important for us to use social media in a way to bring about social justice. We know that this summer we had hundreds and thousands, hundreds of protests. In fact, the Armed Conflict Location Event Data, ACLED, noted that between May 24th and August the 22nd, protests about police brutality that began primarily with, at this time, the death of George Floyd, showed that over 10,600 demonstrations occurred. Over 10,100 of them were peaceful protesters. I mean, 95%, despite what has been told by many of the, especially Republican leaders. Organizations must come together and make commitments to eliminate historical trauma. They do this by making mission statements. An example was the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and they said they are committed to addressing the impact of racism, historical trauma, and engaging in national policy discussions around the issues. They're committed to developing trauma assessments as well as treatment and service guidelines that identify structural and personal racism, historical trauma issues, and the impact of racial injustices. They have other points in their mission statement as well. It is important that we create a human rights movement consisting of diverse groups within on behalf of poor people of all colors. This movement should increase the number of jobs that are available, not jails. Should ensure individuals' rights to quality housing, quality education, equal justice before the law, reallocate some funds for criminal justice programs to the community development. And so we're looking at massive changes in how we do business in the US. In order to do this, we must tell the truth about historical racism, have difficult conversations in churches and schools and in various organizations to raise consciousness about the Black-white past and make visible that which has been made invisible. It's time to disavow distorted history. We must just tell the truth about the economic reason for slavery. Slaves were needed to build America. Just tell the truth about social construction of race to justify enslavement, calling them three-fifth persons when saying that they are Christians. Just telling the truth about Jim Crow and institutionalized racism. Just tell the truth about white privileges and how it has maintained itself over generations. Tell the truth about why Black Lives Matter. Tell the truth about mass incarceration and how the 13th Amendment gives permission to incarcerate and enslave persons who are in the criminal justice system. Just tell the truth about the purpose of voter suppression to disenfranchise Blacks and people of color. Just tell the truth as to whether reparation should be on the table concerning descendants of slaves. Just tell the truth about Blacks' vast contributions to America, some of which has been stolen by whites. So what are the actions that are needed? Embrace criminals, their dignity, humanity by shifting from punishment to rehabilitation. Restore their right to vote. Abolish mass incarceration by ending the war on drugs and treat addiction as a medical problem. Actions needed. Challenge the rules, the policies, and practices that give privileges to one group but deny others. We need to radically change those rules, policies, and practices. Allow communities to make decisions about its needs and possible solutions to its problems. Be allies. Do not take over. Fight against a new movement of criminalizing immigrants. Justice for all is what we needed. In fact, Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so this picture gives you a sense of where we need to be at the point of liberation, where there are no barriers for any party despite their abilities. What we see then is on the lower left hand is what reality, where those who get more and those who have not get less. In fact, what they have is taken from them. And you can see that in the reality picture. We have pushed for equality, that everybody gets the same, but if you start from a different point, getting the same will not give you what you need. What we need in equity and liberation. Equity will get us at the same place. Liberation takes away barriers from everybody. And so, in order to change the trajectory and create a new society, we need to dig deeper for solutions. Despite the historical traumatic treatment I've discussed, we are still here, vibrant, alive, and capable of changing the world, preferably with your help. I'm providing you the references. We're going to do questions and answers, but not quite yet. There's a brief 30-minute video I want to show you that surely tells you what I've been saying.
To my beautiful Black baby, you're being born into a country with history, a history of violence against your skin, where you still have to fight for the care you need. But this moment is a reckoning to change the story of skin. While you're being born, America is being reborn. We're on a 400-year-long journey, and scars don't fade. But neither does hope.
This is Dr. Rosalie Martin. Thank you so much. And we're now open for questions and answers.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Let's start our question and answers. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And if you'd like to speak, you can raise your virtual hand and you'll be unmuted so you can share. Remember to put any questions for our presenters in the Q&A. And I would also like to thank you for joining us today. On the top of our workshop, I asked you some questions, and we have people joining us today from Austin, Round Rock, Kyle, Arlington, Texas, and your favorite ice creams are mint chocolate, French vanilla, butter pecan, strawberry, and vanilla. And butter pecan won out again. You're feeling fine, you're feeling happy, you're feeling tired but excited, and you're having a great day. And I thought it was interesting that today was described in the colors of yellow, red, and green. Along with feeling blessed, I want you to know that the yellow, red, and green struck me because those are colors in the African flag, as well as Black. And if you may not know those colors, the meaning of these colors, yellow stands for harmony and peace. Red stands for the blood that was shed during the struggle and that continues to be shed today. Green is for the land and Black is for the people. Your theme songs were Good as Hell, Lizzo, More Bounce, and Celebrate by Kool and the Gang. And you're getting through the coronavirus with COVID-19 with support from family and friends, prayer, meditation, and yoga. So I'd also like to thank Dr. Martin for such a powerful presentation today. And she happens to be not only a dear friend, but also she was my professor when I attended Houston-Tillotson University. We were younger then, much younger then. So I'd like to I need you to help me welcome Dr. Rosalie Martin. And Dr. Martin, we are ready for questions and answers, questions for you to answer for our audience. And our first question is, would having African American police officers as CIT officers, as SIT officers, help when someone of color is in a mental health crisis? Does race matter then?
So the real question is about if you have a black man, a black officer who is trying to assist another black individual, is race an issue? You can look at that from two different perspectives. Obviously, race is controlled. They're both black, assuming that many of them, that the two of them may have had similar historical experiences. So you could say no. But on the other hand, you know that police officers are trained. Black police officers are, as well as whites and others. And so in some ways, that person may bring to them the culture and values of the police training that they have. But I suspect that an African American or black police officer who actually goes to a mental health crisis intervention experience with a family or someone who calls them in for help, I think an African American would do better.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, just recently, my teenage son told me I make everything about race. I'm having a hard time trying to get him to understand how he can be viewed from systemic racism, but still stand tall and proud in his Blackness.
That is really a great question. I've heard that from young people. You know, I teach at Houston Tillotson, and I've heard that same sentiment that is all about race. And so we tell our students, and I tell my own children, that we have to do our best, and we cannot have the excuse that because of our historical trauma or because of things that have happened to us in our past, that we cannot just fall back and say, that's why. It's important for us to try to reach our potentials, to get the best education possible, to learn more about what is necessary to reach their best. However, race is important, as you've heard from the presentation. Very often we're not seen because of our intellect. We're not seen because of our ability. When I walk into a room, the first thing they see is a Black woman. Black, my race, woman, gender. And sometimes that influences the conversation.
Okay. How do I not internalize racism? I recently started wearing my afro and I feel like white people stare at me and people treat me differently.
Each one of us have to make a decision on how we want to present ourselves. And based upon that decision, we will operate in our skin, so that if you feel comfortable in your African outfits, you're not harming anybody. I think you have to make conscious decisions to be your authentic self, period.
Okay. What is institutional racism?
Excuse me?
What is institutional racism?
Institutional racism, we've already pretty much talked about, it's when racism is built into. So it's not like I personally don't like you. It is like when you apply for a job and they've already had it set up that if a person has a certain kind of name, they're not going to interview you. You know, African American, we often have some very unique, special type names. And so those things are already decided upon. We don't want anybody Black. We can't say that now. That's the microaggression. But I know there are ways in which we can, in fact, separate Blacks out. That's part of institutional racism. Historically, institutional racism was when Blacks could not go to white schools or white. I couldn't go to University of Texas in the 1940s or 50s, although I ended up going in the 60s, 70s to get my master's and my doctorate. That's institutional racism. It's built into the system. And even if I, as a person, would like to admit you to University of Texas in the 40s, I could not do that. It's built into the institution.
Can you explain microaggression?
So microaggression is those kinds of things that, first of all, remember, we live in 2021 and we cannot be overtly racist, and yet we still are. And so microaggressions are those things that we do, such as saying sly remarks about somebody's hairstyle, or not allowing someone to get a job, implying that we can't find a Black person qualified. And therefore, that's why we don't have Blacks in employment. It is those subtle things, but very real. And we pick up on it. We know when someone has been who are racist against us. It's racism, really, much more subtle.
Going back to the question earlier about how a person feels, I just kind of felt compelled to just even share myself today here in regards to feeling comfortable wearing African clothing or with your afro or your hairstyle. And today I have on a African attire, and I feel very comfortable with it. However, I can remember having a very special event to go to one evening. It was a huge gala, and people were wearing gowns and other things, and I wanted to wear my African attire. And my date told me that if I wore that, he was concerned that we would have some negative feedback and some other things would happen. And so I said, if I can't wear this, I'm not going.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm a proud Black woman. I love who I am. I love what I have on. And if I can't wear this, I can't go.
Mm-hmm.
I could see the emotion rise up in it because he had some emotional concerns about having to defend my honor when we arrived at race and explain some things. However, we met up with a very different welcoming, and the people were in awe, and he felt so relieved. And later he apologized and thanked me for being so adamant about being who I am and for people to accept me for who I am. And even after we arrived there, had I not been accepted, I would have just left. I wouldn't have stayed.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that goes back to what you mentioned by having to feel comfortable and having to decide what you're going to do for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very, very important for your self-esteem too, to maybe not even wear African attire ever again because someone said something about how you looked or said something about your hair, but that's who you are. And that's how comfortable you feel in your own skin. So,
and Dr. Martin, we have someone from our audience that would like to ask a question live. It's Dennis Hall. I'm going to invite him to talk.
Sure. Mr. Dennis.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I've done a lot of research on race-based trauma, and it's led me to studying Dr. Joy DeGray and Robert Carter. I'm sure you're familiar with them. One of the questions I have is, I realized Reconstruction was never completed. And though we need to weed out structural racism, I just sense if we don't address intergenerational transmission of trauma and the complex trauma that the inner cities are experiencing today, which prevents trauma from being addressed, that we won't experience true freedom, even though there's racial justice. I just sense that there's I work with a lot of young African-American men, and I worked in a prison for 10 years, and there's a lot of hurt and pain. And I just sense, though we have racial justice, this trauma needs to be addressed, or they'll sabotage it. So I just wonder, where do we find the balance, and how do we address the intergenerational transmission of trauma and the complex trauma of the current racism and structure that they're living in currently? I sense both of them need to be addressed, don't you?
Absolutely. And I believe there's, in the presentation, we talked about the fact that individuals have multiple traumas. I mean, you could have sexual trauma, childhood trauma, etc. So the historical trauma, or the generational trauma, the complex trauma, comes over a period of time. And it's you don't even have to be participating in the past to still be
Sure.
traumatized by the past. And it's part of it because it's reinforced within our society, it's reinforced within our institutions, and parents and grandparents reinforce it for young kids. And so the trauma needs to be dealt with. I ask my students, what is their 11-year-old child saying to you as an adult? And sometimes it is that child that is influencing the adult behavior that may result in the decisions that will end up you being incarcerated. So absolutely, we have to have opportunities to be open and to be received and not in a non-judgment way as we explore the variety of traumas we experience. That can be done obviously through therapy. It can be done with a person who is understanding and caring. But the work is there for us to do. We have to do the work.
I think we need to become more trauma informed as well, because it's just so inconvenient. The price of therapy today, the lack of understanding of race-based trauma, epigenetics, it's lacking.
True. Thank you. We're glad you're out there doing this work.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Martin, we have time for probably one more question. As a community, how do we ensure that we are heard by systematic leaders of injustice? How do we rally while blocking out infiltrators with ulterior motive? How do we collaborate how do we collaborative create accountability with buy-in by the majority? How do we empower ourselves to stand legitimately without resorting to violence, but stand willing to suffer for our unmovable stance?
That seems like both a question and a statement. And that kind of question would take a long time for us. I mean, that's a great question to really spend time addressing. It's important for us to know the history, to understand the implication of our history, and to understand the relationship that we have with our host society, which is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And also to recognize that white people are traumatized even as they traumatize Blacks. Because if a person is holding you down, they cannot reach their potential either. They have to stay in place to keep you in place. And so there's a benefit to everyone to really begin to address this issue. It's important for us not to just do protests. Part of the question was sustainability. How do we sustain efforts to bring about change? It's not a one-time protest. It is people in our community being aligned and agreeing on the specific mission or purpose. It doesn't mean that you don't have different values than people you're working with, but on this one single thing, you're going to work together in order to bring about the change necessary. It has to be sustained over a period of time. You have to work with like-minded people, and then you have to be able to talk to young people about what you're doing, include their voices at the table. Let them know that they are valuable, because actually, as you and I know, we have fewer years ahead of us. We've already lived most of our years. And so we need to engage our young people so they can understand that the world they inherited, that they can make a change in it and make a difference.
Okay, I'd like for you to also know that there has been overwhelming responses and many questions that we were not able to get to today. So those of you who did not have an opportunity to get your question answered, you can follow up with Dr. Martin and she can answer your question. I'm sure she'd be happy to do that. And the overwhelming also response and questions were asked. People wanted, the request was made to have your copy of your presentation, and they were they can drop their emails into the chat, and a lot of people have been doing that. So I know we can follow up with that as well. So thank you again for being with us today and sharing so much wisdom and knowledge and the insight with us. And many thanks to all of you for joining us today. So please take a few minutes to complete the workshop survey. It helps us know how we're doing. And if you're seeking CEU, remember that your forms will be in the survey. The links are in the chat. Thanks again. Please stay safe. And remember that your health is our community's wealth. Take care.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Bye-bye.